Thank you and greetings. Bonsoir. Good evening. Harambek members, Principal Manning, Deputy and Vice Provost Hardy, um, special guests, both of the Institute and of Concordia University, colleagues, sisters in struggle, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Breathing deep. I thank you for the kind words Vice Provost Hardy used to introduce me. Let me just take a moment. Let me say that I too share President Carr's regrets of not being here for this institutional moment. Not being here for this institutional moment to lend the weight and authority of his office to these two important anniversaries. Nonetheless, we all sincerely thank you, Vice Provost Hardy, for being able to step in and represent. I feel honored to be the third recipient of this significant Simone de Beauvoir Prize, a public acknowledgement and recognition by Concordia University. I thank you and I humbly accept this award in the name of so many countless Black women predecessors, other mothers for me, whose lives of backbreaking work, pain, humiliating setbacks, and deferred dreams prepared and paved the way for me and others to make our own contributions. I would like to make the following formal key acknowledgement. It is an indisputable fact that this Western Hemisphere, these three Americas, North, Central, and South, are founded on a racially imperialistic base. And the evidence hides in plain view for us. As critical, in parenthèse, let me say something. If you keep clapping, you're eating into time. I do appreciate it, though. As critical legal scholar Cheryl Harris succinctly explains, the identities of both indigenous peoples and peoples of African descent were first racialized, objectified, and then dehumanized so as to justify the outright appropriation of their land and their labor, respectively. Think of it. This is racial history. It is this deliberate racialization and calculated racial exploitation of two nominal groups that actually forms the basis of our country's economic foundation, development, and cumulative prosperity. But this racial history has been routinely obfuscated and consistently denied. It is part of what Pulitzer Prize writer Toni Morrison termed, and I quote, the unspeakable unspoken. End of quote. Yet the racial legacy that this history spawned lives on in an afterlife of systemic racial exclusion that targets and daily impacts racialized communities, especially Indigenous and Black communities. I would like to take this opportunity at the outset to acknowledge and validate upfront the tenacious drive, effervescent energy, optimism, unfettered vision, and audacity to move forward of the budding Black women's group Harambek. We would not be here this evening had not for the conviction and courage of Harambek. You can go ahead. You don't have to obey me. Je prononcerai mon allocution en anglais. For reasons of linguistic validation, I shall deliver my remarks in English. You see, even though trilingual, I am a Montrealer and Quebecoise whose mother tongue is English. Concordia University, where this landmark course was offered 4 decades ago, is a cornerstone institution and primary contributor to the English culture of La Belle Province. And finally, this groundbreaking course, Black Women, the Missing Pages from Canadian Women's Studies, is a direct outcrop of Montreal's English-speaking Black community. I would therefore like to ensure that my remarks are and remain accessible to English-speaking members of the public. Before proceeding, I want to dedicate this keynote address firstly to a colleague. Congress of Black Women member. Just give me a minute. No. Thank you though. Yeah, okay, I think that did it. Before proceeding, I want to dedicate this keynote address firstly to a colleague, Congress of Black Women member, sister in struggle, and dear departed friend, the late Jane Laster Kukaganga, who, among many other things, served as chair of the Public Relations Committee of the Montreal Regional Committee of the Congress of Black Women of Canada. Jane was catalytic in the piloting of this course to its fruition. I also dedicate these remarks to another colleague, educator, poet, sister in struggle, and cherished friend, Shirley Audrey Small, a past president of the Montreal Regional Committee of Congress, quiet and generous giver to so many of us Black women. Shirley would unstintingly share and continues to share her wisdom, ethical vision, and humanity with individuals and collectivities alike. And lastly, I also wish to pay homage to all those foremothers, other mothers, and sisters in struggle, past and present, who collectively, both directly and indirectly, have painstakingly contributed over the years to creating the context that now frames this commemoration. And the word commemoration is indeed le mot juste, the right term for this occasion. For you see, I have to blow my nose, excuse me. For you see, while commemoration carries with it an aspect of celebration, it also importantly comports and conveys the idea of critical evaluation. And as peoples of African descent in this Western Hemisphere, our collective experience and reality are such that celebrations for us are of necessity always tempered with sobering reflection, probing examination, and searching retrospective. My title, Still Here Burning Bright and Strong. Let me change the inflection. Still here, burning bright and strong. The flame Black women fuel in the struggle against ongoing racism in Canada. After brushing for you an overview of the course, the context of its genesis, the class itself, and course content, I shall then address the course's significance and the lessons learned before concluding. In July 1982, Simone de Beauvoir Institute played host to and welcomed women delegates from around the world to an unprecedented conference on teaching and research related to women. The idea of the course, Black Women, the Missing Pages from Canadian Women's Studies, took shape in the crucible of this unique global gathering, where sadly, omnipresent racial tension, racist friction, differing perspectives, and diametrically opposing priorities textured the ambient air as women delegates faced off and confronted each other and our respective differing realities. For example, a frontline as frontline eyewitness, we Congress members listened, registered, and relived vicariously the traumatic experience of a Caribbean delegate billeted in the city of Laval, who recounted to us how, while standing in line with other commuters awaiting the public bus one morning, she was approached and unceremoniously taken out of the queue by Laval police. The police officers demanded identification and interrogated her at such length that she missed the infrequent bus. When they finished, she asked why. And the officers informed her that there had been a complaint. Someone had seen her and, I quote, was wondering what she was doing in the neighborhood, end of quote. Another stunning irregularity. Despite having respected all conference submission deadlines, African Canadian and a number of African American conference presenters could not find our name and presentations listed in the official printed conference program. Sadly, our names and the titles of our papers were nowhere to be found, curiously omitted. Yet another illustration. We Congress members witnessed African delegates openly weeping inconsolably at the conference and in the streets of Montreal because of the civil unrest that had suddenly erupted back home, that engulfed and overwhelmed them with grief and uncertainty over the fate of their family members and loved ones. Sadly, the conference offered them no safe haven, primarily because the majority of conferees and organizers had absolutely no inkling whatsoever of what was going on in the lives and spaces of these African sisters. In light of this, we Congress members felt that we conf- conferees of African descent shared a strong yearning to meet together with utmost urgency. But we found ourselves repeatedly thwarted at every turn in our attempts to secure a space during the conference for us to gather as women of African descent. Nevertheless, we persisted, procured a room, quickly got the word out, and met, holding a family gathering one evening with self identifying women of African descent hailing from 18 different countries. Together, we discussed various similar perspectives and shared our experiences about the prevailing atmosphere and certain incidents that had occurred at the conference. We quickly came to the realization that this palpable racial animus, conscious or not, intentional or not, was a common global phenomenon against which we women of African descent had to strategize internationally. International strategizing. Strat- international strategizing. Thus it was that the international organization, International Resource Network for Women of African Descent, the acronym UNRWAD, was founded then and there in Montreal in that very meeting room by more than 30 self identifying women of African descent. Headquartered in Baltimore, USA, it was launched in New York City 6 months later on March the 8th, 1983, International Working Women's Day. And in 1985, UNRWAD convened its first conference in Zimbabwe under the theme Women and Food. Immediately following the conference, we felt that as a local organization, it behooved Congress to raise our concerns with both the conference organizers and the Simone de Beauvoir Institute and call attention notably to the serial irregularities of a racial nature, the omnipresent and pervasive racial tension, and the glaring and palpable racial divide. Very much to its credit, very much to its credit, the Simone de Beauvoir Institute was receptive and open to dialogue. Principal Dr. Maïr Vertuy listened and agreed, and that it was urgent for us all to begin, and I quote her words, making women's studies relevant to all women, end of quote. Wherewith she invited Congress, represented by its Public Relations Committee Chair, Jane Kukaganga, to submit a proposal for an accredited course on Black women's studies. We in Congress were elated at this breakthrough. Our hopes surged with visions of the beginnings of a true collaborative partnership aimed at real sisterhood. And we congratulated Principal Dr. Mayer Vertuy and the Simone de Beauvoir Institute on this proactive institutional initiative, which indubitably would enrich the Institute's current curricular offerings and contribute to what we saw as transformative change in Concordia University. We cooperated, and with the assistance of Jane, a mere 6 months after that memorable international gathering, in January 1983, under the aegis of Congress, I formally submitted two complimentary 3-credit courses. Not one, two. Black Women 1, Black Women, the Missing Pages from Canadian Women's Studies. Black Women 2, Women of Color Speak Out, Confrontation and Collaboration, Issues and Implications for Canadian Women's Studies. The course proposal submission included course description, course outline, syllabus, reading list, bibliographical list, and an appendix containing the two thematic papers which Jane Kukaganga and I had each presented at the international conference. Jane authored the paper. A particular approach is necessary when researching controversial issues about women in the third world. That was her paper. My own paper, Black Women's Studies in Teaching Related to Women, Help or Hindrance to Universal Sisterhood. That paper became the pilot for the Black Women 1 course, Black Women, the Missing Pages from Canadian Women's Studies. With lightning speed, the two courses received university approval. However, Congress was subsequently informed that administrative imperatives allowed only for the scheduling of Black Women 1 as a summer session evening course. Summer session evening course during the months of May and June. Okay? We're in March already, during the month. And so it was that upon my return to Montreal in March 1983 from a trip to New York to launch UNWAD, I learned with blindsided surprise that Concordia and the Institute, Simone de Beauvoir, had publicly announced an open registration for the course Black Women Missing Pages from Canadian Women's Studies, which will be offered starting in May, a mere 2 months away. As the publicly designated instructor, my readiness and availability had been unthinkingly assumed, despite the fact that I was already fully employed elsewhere. This parachuted summer course would constitute for myself a considerable add on in addition to my regular full time job. All this went against my own personal expectations around what I term the etiquette of collaboration and the ethics of partnership, both of which seem to have been swept aside and forgotten along the way in the name of administrative imperatives and institutional expediency barreling ahead. For this reason, publicized news of this course's imminent start date was understandably met by myself with misgivings and very mixed feelings. Congress's high hopes for Black women's empowerment and the positive transformative change within the university had become somewhat dampened, if not dashed. I myself felt disempowered. My agency, autonomy, and authority had been compromised at multiple levels. Yet the die had been cast. As Black women, our individual and collective experience on the periphery, at the margins, have taught us that the shutting of access doors in quotes, temporarily or exceptionally held ajar for us, exact a heavy toll if admission as offered is not accepted immediately with alacrity. Once refused, Such doors of access are usually peremptorily and definitively bolted shut. A real dilemma. How to reclaim, reassert, and conserve the power of Congress, as well as my own agency, autonomy, and authority as a Black woman. All this in the face of bulldozing unilateral institutional decisions. In plain words, how to ensure that the gift of this all important course will be appropriately presented to us, tastefully gift wrapped with gilded paper and ribbon, and not put in a brown paper bag. After strongly expressing my surprise and disappointment, I decided that despite my being put in this untenable position, the circumstances dictated that Congress not squander the opportunity. I had no option but to teach the course at the time as designated by administrative exigencies. But we needed to hold the Institute Simone de Beauvoir accountable. I therefore accepted to teach the course contingent on fulfillment of 6 conditions, themselves predicated on institutional accountability. One, that Institut Simone de Beauvoir mobilized customary university resources to prepare and convene a press conference to formally announce this course and underscore its unique significance for Concordia University. Two, that from its own institutional perspective, the Institut Simone de Beauvoir take full upfront ownership of the course and confer the gravitas or weight of its own imprimatur by penning an article about Black women, the missing pages from Canadian women's studies, to be published in media of the institutional academic milieu, not in the student newspaper. That three, that the Institut Simone de Beauvoir muster and mobilize its resources and provide institutional support by scanning the existing university library holdings so as to identify those publications relevant to the course and accordingly prepare a list of these materials that would be fully accessible to students. Four, that to support the course and enrich the Institute's documentation center, Institut Simone de Beauvoir provide me, the instructor, with a supporting acquisition budget to purchase key course-specific material as designated by myself. Five, that Institut Simone de Beauvoir expand and open up access to the course. This is important. Open up access to the course by ensuring that marketing publicity information go well beyond the Institute's walls to other units across Concordia, to the women's studies divisions of sister universities like McGill, UQAM, and Université de Montréal, as well as to the general public. Six, that course enrollment be capped at 30 students. After all, I had to do the corrections. Again, to the credit of Simone de Beauvoir Institute, the response here was open and positive. The stipulated article, written by Victoria Monkman to herald the course and its significance and to validate it with the gravitas deserved, was published in the Concordia University faculty newspaper, the Thursday Report, on April the 13th, 1983. Simone de Beauvoir did convene a formal press conference. As we descended the stairs in the old building to the press conference room, Principal Dr. Meyer Vitry tried to forewarn and prepare me with a gentle, apologetic explanation that at the last Institute hosted press conference, only 2 people had shown up. To everyone's surprise, especially the Institut Simone de Beauvoir's, this press conference was resoundingly successful, with print, radio, and television in attendance, along with members of the general public. As requested, the course enrollment was closed when a maximum of 30 students registered, from students of Concordia and other sister universities to a retired French Canadian housewife grandmother and a socially assisted single parent auditing the course. A very diversified group of women made up that first class, which was intergenerational, multiracial, and multicultural. White, Black, women of color who were Anglophone and Francophone were students of women's studies and who hail from other disciplinary units within Concordia and from the other universities. The list of existing documentation center and Concordia library holdings relevant to the course and accessible to students was provided as requested. However, the budget allocated, it gets better, to make the budget allocated to make course specific acquisitions from my customized listing a piffling $100. A piffling $100. This budget was never spent in its entirety. Why? Because, as I was informed by the documentation center, they did not, this is quote, did not purchase books not written by women, end of quote. In other words, many of my listed resource materials were authored by men and were therefore ineligible for purchase. Example, Robin Winks, written by a white man, Blacks in Canada, the only thing existing at the time that was as comprehensive as it was. Leo Bertley, Canada and its peoples of African descent. None of these. So that budget of $100 did not get spent. And let me just say here that it was too small a battle. I had too many other things to deal with for me to take it on. Classroom and content. Let me just say a word about this. This perspective and pedagogical approach, which combine theory and praxis, the course symbolized a radical departure from the traditional women's studies course offered in Canada. Geared to sensitizing students to the place of Black women's studies as a legitimate, indispensable part of Canadian women's studies, the course trained a glaring spotlight on the conspicuous absence of Black women from present Canadian women's studies. Black women's reality, perspectives, experiences, concerns, contributions. Black women's voices were nowhere to be found. The classroom was conceived first and foremost as a safe anti racist learning space where active, open participation by all was paramount. While the language of instruction was English, all students were nevertheless given the option to submit their written assignments in either English or French. It is the centrality of African descended peoples that grounded this course. Its interdisciplinary pedagogical approach and methodology were simultaneously informed by critical race theory, aimed primarily at building, improving, and enhancing the race literacy of all learners. Instruction was delivered via a combination of lectures and open plenary seminar like discussions, where students were encouraged to speak consciously from their own respective location and vantage point. Films and music were indispensable complements. Students viewed 5 films altogether and also benefited from a guest lecture on Black women in Canada by noted Montreal role model Dr. Dorothy Wills. A significant and memorable hands-on mandatory field trip to the Montreal North Courthouse allowed the entire class, this field trip was mandatory. It allowed the entire class to witness together in person and in real time the criminal trial of a Black Haitian woman who, shopping while Black, had become the victim of ever escalating subjective racial profiling, unwarranted aggression, and eventual criminalization by the police. At the checkout counter of a local grocery chain store, a sharp disagreement arose between the cashier and a Black woman shopper over an advertised promotional sales item. The argument so intensified that the Black customer declared to the cashier that the store could keep the item because she no longer intended to buy it, wherewith she left the counter. Instead of letting the matter drop and end there, the cashier's immediate subjective reaction was to escalate the situation and seek power reinforcement by appealing to the store manager. The store manager arrived, and he, in turn, used his authority not to diffuse the matter and let it drop, but to further escalate the situation. He sought power reinforcement by calling in the police. Two police officers arrived on the scene, and after conferring with the store manager and cashier, they, in their turn, invoked state power to legitimate the subjective racial profiling and baseless escalation initiated by the checkout cashier. The police officers pointedly approached, up to then, they had not spoken to her. She was outside. The police officers pointed, not outside, she had left. The police officers pointedly approached the black woman who was awaiting her taxi in the store's vestibule, you know, the entrance, store's vestibule, and they ordered her to vacate the premises. She complied. Once outside, even though when demanded she presented her Canadian citizenship card for identification, she was nevertheless manhandled, thrown to the ground by the two officers, handcuffed, arrested, and taken away in custody to spend several hours locked up in jail. The police then invoked the full power of the law and legal system to further escalate the matter by deflecting and laying formal criminal charges against this black woman for having aggressed them. Hence, the students' attendance at this trial. The sheer presence, I can tell you, the sheer presence and number of students, journalists, and women rights advocates in the courtroom created uncustomary stir for the staff of the modest courthouse. Insufficient chairs meant standing room only for the entire day for many of us. Our collective presence and our focused, serious demeanor, let me just say, I had coached my class before. No gum chewing, no whispering. They will just look for a pretext to clear the courtroom. Our collective presence and our focused, serious demeanor proved to be quite an irritant for the bench. At one point, this presiding elderly white judge was announcing to the courtroom his intent to adjourn proceedings during the afternoon for a certain period of time so that he could watch la navette spatiale, the space shuttle, pass. But suddenly, he abruptly broke off speech and getting ahead of myself. I'm reliving it as I talk, okay? But suddenly, he abruptly broke off speech mid sentence to peer. He actually peered piercingly over the rims of his spectacles. Scanning and scrutinizing the room, he stated in stentorian tones that he had noticed a lot of people with pencils and pens writing. He admonished that people should, and I'm quoting, people should not, quote, make of this what it is not, end of quote. And then he declared with affirmation, I quote, in Montreal North, there is no racism and there will not be. For the, for the entire class, that singular frontline hands-on trip really moved the needle on their race consciousness. It demonstrated to students the importance of race literacy, of understanding just how, with insidiously systemic precision, the factor of race operates in everyday life. Students truly started to comprehend to the point where the retired, reticent French Canadian grandmother student found a moment during the afternoon to come over shyly and apologetically whisper to me confidentially, I always smile, and I quote, Professor, mon Dieu, that particular store is where for years we go to buy our groceries, end of quote. And then with resolve, she affirmed to me in the next breath, quote, I'm going to tell my husband that we can no longer shop there. End of quote. To ensure participation, growth, and progress in race literacy, class attendance was compulsory, representing 15%, that's a lot, of the final grade, which was completed by two assignments worth 40% and 45% respectively. The course itself was divided into three main blocks. Block one was introductory and consisted of three parts: ideological, historical, and theoretical or conceptual. Block two covered a historical overview of Black women in slavery and under triple oppression, race, class, and sex. Block three addressed Black women now issues, and implications in the contemporary. Black women, the missing pages was and remains significant at so many different levels, both inside and outside the academy. To the Simone de Beauvoir Institute and Concordia University, to women's studies and to institutional stakeholders defending women, to state authorities and power brokers of public policy and public institutions, to Black women, Black women's groups, past and present, and to the Black community of Montreal, Quebec, and Canada. For the Institute Simone de Beauvoir, Black Women, the Missing Pages from Canadian Women's Studies represents a positive, forward-looking initiative on the part of the Institute towards building that aspirational universal sisterhood where all women would be represented. For Concordia University, missing Black women's Black women, the missing pages constitutes or should constitute a groundbreaking and significant academic milestone in higher education leadership. Concordia had and has the possibility to be seen as the leader of this kind of thing, a positive response to the historical neglect of and institutional disregard for Black women, and more specifically, our ensuing exclusion, participating in academic knowledge production through teaching, research, and scholarship. Given Concordia University, Sir George Williams passed, Black Women, the Missing Pages represents a much needed bridge between Concordia University and the Montreal Black community. Missing Pages also symbolizes an indirect outreach opportunity for Concordia as a taxpayer publicly funded institution to shoulder its social responsibility of public education that goes well beyond those enrolled tuition paying students. I firmly believe that universities have a public responsibility for public education, not for those who pay you money, because you're funded by the general public funds. For women's studies, for women's studies, Black women, the missing pages will forever stand as a lasting and stinging indictment of the traditionally accepted North American white women's movement for being colorblind, short sighted, and tunnel visioned. Missing pages served as an eye opening window flung wide to expose the fault lines of racial exclusion that still beset our society. Missing pages revealed the naive, self absorbed white feminists that universal sisterhood remained and still in reality does remain an aspirational goal and is not yet the universal fait accompli consensus that so many euphorically assumed because of the colorblind stance they consciously and unconsciously espouse. Black women, the missing pages, moved the needle. It raised the level of debate and improved the quality of discourse, thereby disrupting traditionally accepted epistemology and discourse about women and about feminism in Canada. For women's studies, missing pages also unearth the obfuscated historical presence of Black women and our true daily reality in Canada. Missing pages shed light on the little known tradition of Black women's groups in North America lifting as they climb, lifting up and uplifting family, community, collectivity, and indeed society at large. A case in point. The Color Women's Club of Montreal, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, women's organization in Canada, was at the crux or birth of heritage institutions, which the club supported and helped to maintain, such as Union United Church, where they purchased the baptismal font, and the Negro Community Center, now defunct, where they renovated the washrooms. They were always maintaining the institutions. A de facto, veritable Ministry of Social Services before all of that for Black communities, poor and let me start that over. A de facto veritable Ministry of Social Services for the Montreal Black communities, poor and destitute. The Colored Women's Club purchased and maintained 2 burial plots in Côte des Neiges Cemetery, as well as a hospital bed in Grace Dart Hospital. The club interceded regularly on behalf of Black community members in matters of education, immigration, employment, and the like. The club structured and set up social programs such as the Sepia Girls Social Club, established for the benefit of the community, especially for the isolated Caribbean Black women brought into this country under the Canadian government domestic scheme program to labor as maids in the homes of the well to do. And during the Great Depression, the club operated a public soup kitchen for all. For state authorities, power brokers of public policy and public institutions, Black women, the missing page, constitute a reality check and warning against deliberate, active, and indirect, yet very calculated attempts to race erasure, not just of Black women, but of Black people. Attempts to obliterate the physical presence and wipe out the experience of all Black women and Black people from Canada's national narrative, and to expunge our long-standing contributions to the history and development of this country from coast to coast. Missing pages expose and debunk the widespread dominant group false belief that good or well meaning intentions absolve an individual of racism. They do not. Neither can good intent nullify, expunge, or rescind inescapable racial reckoning that this province, country, and Western Hemisphere find ourselves increasingly being called upon to address. For Black women inside and outside the Academy, Missing Pages started to excavate the ongoing historical presence of Black women and to formally record in blistering detail the true daily material reality of our lives, told in our own voices of authenticity. For Black women like myself, Black women Missing Pages held and still hold and hold held and still holds white women accountable for deploying their white privilege to imperialistically appropriate feminist space exclusively as theirs by declaring their individual particular experience to be the norm and therefore universally applicable to all women. You all are so disciplined. As the fruit of collaborative partnership between Congress of Black Women and the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, Missing Pages represented for us a proactive and affirmative step forward. Missing Pages attempted to break with and rupture the historical continuity of racism. It symbolized how the legitimate claiming of meaningful partner space in the academy, partner, not just partner space, partnership space in the academy, partnership space with concomitant appraisal and veto power, must at every turn still reckon with the burdens and obstacles of racial history and clear away the multiple hurdles to racial equality littering the track that racial history has set in place. In sum, Missing Pages symbolize a breaking of silence for Black women's studies, validates our Black women's voices of authenticity, and shows how our varied experiences must perforce form an integral, indispensable part of Canada's national narrative and Canadian feminist discourse. Our voices and perspectives, too, must inform the aesthetic, the theoretical, and the philosophical. For myself, I'm getting close to the end. For myself, I see Black women, the missing pages, as an important chapter in the primer of lessons learned. Over and above all, missing pages constituted and constitutes yet another lesson in how to navigate white spaces, especially institutional spaces. Thanks to our Black women foremothers and other mothers, we Black women today know, we know that we are not stepping out into uncharted waters or trekking unmapped territory. In battle, we have waged unrelenting anti racism warfare for generations in the theater of life. The ensuing result is that we can now move forward with the solid confidence that our knowings and conclusions have already been tested and hammered out in the laboratory of life. And the existence of racism dictates that moving forward, politics and protocol, the etiquette of collaboration, and the ethics of partnership should not be whimsically or cavalierly set aside. In conclusion, that always allows people to relax. The end is in sight. Back then in 1983, many considered it a bold and brazen move. For in its theme, perspective, and approaches, Black Women, the Missing Pages was a uniquely disruptive and unsettling departure from other traditional courses dealing with Blacks or with women. Missing Pages set a high bar. It targeted transformative institutional change. Admittedly, yes, for sure, a number of things have changed. Task forces, implementation committees, surveys, studies, and reports aplenty abound, alongside creative, freshly minted job titles, offices, and units, as well as novel acronymic speak, such as EDI and BIPOC. A quantity of celebrations and acknowledgments are observed with performative regularity, thereby telegraphing to us the message that a new level of race awareness now prevails. But is it for show or is it for sure? Institutions such as Concordia cannot afford to continue slouching towards meaningful equality with dragging feet. Today, we would all agree, I think, Black lives matter. Black women's lives matter. Then it follows Black representation does indeed matter. To what extent, I ask you, can the pioneering pride, sense of achievement, and institutional commitment that Simone de Beauvoir so freely and genuinely expressed back in 1983 today be seen, visibly reflected and refracted back as institutional, as racial strides of progress in epistemology, scholarship, and staffing? Do you want me to repeat that? Yeah. Louder, you said? Oh, okay. I asked the question, to what extent can the pioneering pride, sense of achievement, and institutional commitment that Simone de Beauvoir Institute so freely and genuinely expressed back in 1983 today be seen, visibly refracted and reflected as racial strides of progress in epistemology, scholarship, and staffing? You could say hiring. Harambec's flame-keeping 40th anniversary commemoration constitutes what I call historical recovery, an act of agency, now pulling this trailblazing course out from the shadows of oblivion and bringing it into the limelight at center stage. This 40th commemoration acknowledges, celebrates, and underscores the original initial commitment of both the Simone de Beauvoir Institute and Concordia University. It validates the value of Montreal's Congress of Black Women's singular initiative. It honors the legacy of unrelenting anti-racist struggles at home and abroad, resolutely waged by all those embattled Black women predecessors in Montreal. As part of the current inescapable global, regional, national, societal, and institutional reckoning around racism, today's 40th commemoration also authenticates the passing of the torch of struggle to tomorrow's flame keepers. For neither passage of time institutional neglect, societal disregard, nor the tide of mortal memory can extinguish the flame Black women lit and continue to fuel in the struggle against ongoing racism. And thank you for your patience and your kind attention.